Just to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Super. Thanks very much to Kit and to the rest of council staff, to the ecosystem work group for coordinating this with council staff, and to all the advisory body members and members of the public who have joined us this morning. I really appreciate it. My name is Chris Harvey. I'm from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and I'm joined by Dr. Andy Lysing from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And I'm just really happy to welcome Andy, as this will be our first time presenting this together. And Andy and I also want to start by acknowledging and thanking Dr. Toby Garfield, who's also at the Southwest Science Center, who co-led this report with me from 2015 to 2022. And Toby's had to wear quite a few additional hats for the agency in recent years and has passed the baton to Andy, but Toby's work on the ecosystem status report over the years has been so essential to what the report is today. So thank you to Toby. All right. All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. All right, does that look okay?
Looks good.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we'll start with a summary of the key takeaways from 2022 as summarized in our report, which is in the March briefing book. First, the basin scale climate patterns started out encouragingly for the California current, but were partly offset later in the year by some local dynamics as well as a major marine heat wave yet again. The food web exhibited some resilience to all of this, including the strong ongoing anchovy production in the south, and fishery landings and revenue were up in 2022 compared to 2020 and 2021. There were some mixed ecological signals in the food web. The base of the food web and forage was productive in the central and southern portions of the system, but more mixed in the north. There are also mixed signals for Chinook salmon returns in different regions. We saw good production of predators in the central and southern parts of the system, and it looks like we may be in for a strong new year class of sablefish from 2021. We also are reporting on some more unfavorable conditions and risk factors. We, as mentioned, have a major marine heat wave that had coastal influence in 2022, also a dry spring, which contributed to ongoing drought. There was an uptick in harmful algal blooms in late 2022 in the north. And we also continue to see less diversification in fishing portfolios. And then finally, we're starting to get better focus on the potential constraints of offshore wind energy on fishing and on surveys. So that's our general summary. We're going to do things a little differently than we have in the past and start the main portion of the presentation with a month-by-month year in review, and I will turn that over to Andy.
Great, thanks. Before I start, can you hear me all right, Chris?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Let's go right on to the next slide then. So as Chris said, we decided to kind of give you a little bit different style here. We're going to walk through essentially month by month because I think we felt like this was the best way to give you an idea of how things were changing over time and make the story a little simpler. So as Chris might have mentioned in the opening, starting in January 2022, there's things like the PDO and the ENSO El Nino index. Those indicators were actually saying things would be good. And so this sort of map on the left is kind of generally showing what you'd expect under those conditions, which would be warm waters out in the middle of the Pacific, but a nice cool coast and cool coastal upwelling, good conditions during the year. So that's what we were expecting for 2022. And also we started out the year good in terms of precipitation. We had some nice high winter precipitation, at least in the Northwest. The Southwest was still a little bit of dry condition, but in general, the conditions started how we thought they should. Okay, next slide, please. So, but already in February, there was a little bit of a hiccup because we saw a heat wave coming in. That's what the map on the left is showing. So all the red that's outlined by the dark, thick line, that is actually the heat wave. It started quite early in 2022. But closer to shore, things were actually still looking good in February, and that's what we're highlighting on the right here, the sort of red zone over the top of the upwelling. What those squiggly lines are showing is the upwelling. And so we actually had somewhat early and fairly strong upwelling from those 3 different indicator locations up. Things were still looking good, mostly at the coast in February. Next slide. Okay, and if we look at some of the biological response, nice spot we have off Oregon where they look at the copepods there. So this is a picture of, on the left, of the copepod Calanus marshallet, and Calanus marshallet is the nice big fatty hamburger sort of metaphor, something that everybody likes to eat. And in fact, this picture, you can actually see the lipid in there is that sort of big clear like globule through the middle of the animal, that huge thing. That's all fatty lipids, good stuff to eat. And actually, from the data, we saw that in 2022, it was one of the highest values of those copepods seen for quite a long time. So things, again, were looking really good at the start and still in March. Okay, next slide. And again, still through April, things were still positive for most of the ecosystem as we kind of were thinking it would be. So this is a look at the habitat compression index, and it was a high value, meaning things were good. We had nice, cool coastal conditions up and down the whole coast. But by this point, we were starting to see a general drought conditions on land. So we weren't getting the rain and things that we needed on land at this point. Next slide. And then by May, this is when things started to take a little bit of a dive here in the system. So in May, what happened was we started to have the first of these very large anomalous low atmospheric pressure cells. It's kind of on this map on the left. It's kind of, yep, Chris is pointing right at it. That big cell. This is the first one of these came in May. And this started to really affect the system. So if you can see it, there's sort of the heat wave to the south coming towards, it's getting closer and closer to the shore. And instead of nice upwelling winds, the winds are actually going from the sort of California-Oregon border. The winds are all going north instead of going south. So that's the opposite of what we'd like to see for May. So that actually ends up being a sort of downwelling event rather than upwelling. At the same time, though, we still had the sort of hangover in the central and south regions of decent prey items were still available at this point. So we had a decent anchovy, an actual uptick in krill, sort of in the sort of central region. And then to the south, we had actually tons of anchovy and plenty of market squid. So the prey was still looking good at this point. Okay, next slide. Now by June, we really start to see some disruptions. And at this point, again, another one of these really strongly low features. Yep, that's it right there. The atmospheric pressure feature came in, disrupted the system, and this essentially let that heat wave get right to the coast in Northern California, and again led to a prolonged period of downwelling winds. Not only that, but this was the period when Seattle region got slammed with that first big atmospheric river storm. So that atmospheric river is directly related to that, the combination of that placement of that big low pressure cell, which was quite anomalous. And it was at this point that we saw a nosedive in the numbers of those nice big fatty copepods. So this plot on the left is showing that by June, all the nice big fatty copepods had kind of gone away from that Oregon location. Next slide.
It's okay, man.
Was that a question? Okay. Then going on to July, even worse at this point. In mid-July, the heat wave had actually reached most of the shore from Central California all the way up through Washington. And although this graph on the right shows habitat compression, the arrows are just showing the overall trend. But if you look at the final dot on there, the summertime HCI, it was back to a sort of normal, the average value, which basically indicates that there was some compression happening. Next slide, please. And then even more heat wave come August. In fact, this is close to the date at which the heat wave reached its sort of maximum size for the summertime. And you can see, again, it's covering most of the Northern California up through Washington coast. And this had some impact, again, on the prey that were out there. So we saw, again, reduced numbers of the cold water copepods in the north that were good for everything to eat. And it was sort of a shift from the hamburger to the celery mode. So we had other copepods starting to be there that would be the warm water species. And then in more sort of the central region, we have some data showing that the krill were actually smaller as adults than you would normally get. And again, that's thought to be due to these warmer temperatures that they were encountering. So when it's warm, the crustaceans tend to not grow as large as adults. Next slide, please. Okay, and so interestingly enough, though, even with all these perturbations, there was some late season upwelling. So the plot on the left shows we had a nice big patch of strong upwelling there inside that sort of red band, and that was happening right around late August and into September. But at the same time, we had our first of our closures. So razor clams were closed on the Quinault beaches, you can read it here, starting in September and all the way down into Oregon. Okay, so we had some closures due to domoic acid. Next slide, please. And it just kind of gets worse from there. So in October, again, even more expansive heat wave up and down the entire coast. And in October, the mussel fishery was closed again due to domoic acid exceedances. Next slide. Okay, so we finally actually got some relief from the heat wave in mid-November. So by mid-November, things changed. There was still another big storm that came through, but you'll notice the pressure field is in a different place, and that was enough to actually sort of push the heat wave offshore and cool the coastal waters temporarily there. But at the same time, we also still had yet more closures. So by this point in November, all the razor clam fishing was closed for all of Washington and Oregon. And next slide, please. And then finally, we have in December still even more of the full Aleutian low coming in, and another massive atmospheric river that comes in, kind of sandwiched between the Aleutian low and the what's called the Pacific High, and that delivered this brutal system here that was all over the newspapers, bringing in lots of rain and eventually snow to the Pacific Northwest. And by the end of December, we had already had quite high snowpack in the Pacific Northwest. And next slide, please. So kind of summarizing up the physics here, we sort of had the expectation based on these large scale indices at the beginning of the season that things would be really good. And we thought things would look like that map in the middle. And in fact, overall, the graph on the right is telling you sort of what was the upwelling like during the season. And the thing it's important to look at this is that the red line is actually right on top of the climatology, which is the black line. So in general, the upwelling looked like what we thought it would. It looked about average and decent for the whole season. But when you use the average, you're not really telling the full story. So next slide, please. Because instead what we got were these strong storms, basically, these strong Aleutian lows that were coming through the system during the summertime, which is not the typical case. And those caused the middle panel here, which is the upwelling, to be instead of a nice smooth line over time and on average, instead it caused it to be highly variable. So we had periods of very strong positive upwelling and then very strong negative downwelling, essentially. And that led to all these disruptions in the system from what we would have expected. So the bottom graph of the lower right is essentially showing the time when the heat waves were coming in and covering large swaths of the EEZ. So that's all the red in there is when more than 50% of the EEZ gets covered by heat waves. So that was quite a bit of time during the late summer and fall. Next slide. Okay, and then I'm going to hand back over to Chris, and he's going to connect some more dots with the biological response.
Thanks a lot, Andy. That's a great introduction to how some of the species in the food web responded or perhaps actually went against the grain from what we would have expected. We'll start with just a general overview of the foraging conditions. And indicators of foraging conditions, which mainly come from surveys in May and June, varied from north to south. And I'm going to ask if folks can just remember to mute their lines, please. Thanks. So in the north, off of Washington and Oregon, we saw, as you can see in this heat map here, that combines lots of time series into one convenient little heat map and via cluster analysis, that there was a shift in 2022 as marked by that solid line there in the composition of the pelagic community. Compared to the previous regime that had set up from about 2018 to 2021. And this shift in forage composition up in the north seemed mainly to have been driven by some increases in salmon, but definitely some increases in jellyfish that we associate more with warm or offshore waters. We also, as Andy mentioned, saw that big drop in the fat-rich copepods. It was much earlier than normal, and the relatively average krill indexes from the north. And deck biologists that were out in May and June reported what they called a bird desert, where a lot of the seabirds that they would see offshore at this time of year just weren't there. They saw really low numbers of sooty shearwaters and common murres out there. So overall, there was this change that was apparent in the north, despite what we would have expected for a La Nina year and a negative PDO year. And Andy already told you what probably was contributing to that was very low upwelling and even downwelling during the spring off of this portion of the coast. In contrast, in the central and southern portions of the system, feeding conditions seemed to be more consistent with what we've seen for the past several years. We did not see a shift in the overall composition of the pelagic forage communities in either the central region here or the southern region here. There's no solid black line indicating statistically that something was really all that different. And as Andy also mentioned before, we might be able to attribute this to just really good downwelling conditions, at least during times, these big spikes in upwelling that would have driven local production. Anchovy continued to be very abundant in the central and southern portions of the system, and there were also pretty good catches of several other groups as well, so a more diverse food web. The abundance of anchovies was also reflected in the coastal pelagic species survey that was out in June. You can see all those green circles that are in this map from Mexico all the way up into around Bodega Bay reflect very large biomasses of anchovies. And when you sum those across the survey, you can see that in 2022, there was once again a dominant signal of anchovy in this community. So while we're talking about anchovy, their high productivity, as I mentioned, is continuing, and it's been supporting a lot of predators in several different regions. We saw once again in 2022 relatively good production in terms of the number of fledglings produced by seabirds in Central California, just off of the San Francisco area, for several different species that feed on fish. We also saw a relatively good pup weight of California sea lions in San Miguel Islands colony in September. So good availability of prey over the summer. We just recently got data on their overwinter growth rate, and that continues to be high as well. So continuing good food supply for the food web over the fall and winter. And we also are lagging a little bit with our data on HMS diets, but it does seem clear that HMS in the central and southern portions of the system have been taking advantage of this food supply. The proportion of the prey items that are in swordfish diets has definitely ticked up toward anchovy over the last several years after they were basically absent from their diets before. Anecdotally, you can see that individual HMS, such as this particular bluefin tuna, are consuming anchovies by the hundred when they have the opportunity. Chinook salmon are, from the Central Valley are also feeding on anchovy when they're out at sea, but it's a little unclear for us if this constitutes a benefit or potentially something to be concerned about. We definitely are seeing Chinook salmon from the Central Valley preying heavily on anchovy. We might also anticipate that all those anchovy out there provide some buffer from predation for smaller Chinook salmon when they first go out to sea. However, as has been documented in our report in the past and in other sources, anchovy also could be causing thiamine deficiency when the Chinook salmon consume them. There's an enzyme in anchovy that breaks down thiamine in the stomach contents of Chinook salmon, and they pass that thiamine deficit onto their eggs. So we're not really sure if the relationship between all that anchovy biomass and Chinook salmon on the whole is positive or negative, and that's just still an area of active research. Speaking of salmon a little bit more, salmon signals were mixed by life history region and by life history stage over the last couple of years. Starting with the stoplight table that we produce each year for the Northern California current, it looks a little bit different this year because, as we documented in the report, we've been working with the SSC to update the way we approach this. But what's clear, at least at the start, for the Northern California table for Chinook returning to the Columbia Basin and Coho returning to the Oregon coast, is that mismatch that Andy talked about, where the basin scale, the large scale indicators were encouraging for us, but the more local physical dynamics of the northern portion of the system actually were somewhat discouraging, as indicated by those warmer colors compared to the cooler colors that we use to represent good conditions in this stoplight format. So those conditions we expect will influence coho returns this coming year, although we're honestly not sure what that's going to mean, if the basin scale or the local scale is going to win out as far as a dependable signal. Signals from the previous smolt year, 2021, were more positive, as you see in this other column that's highlighted here, and that's encouraging for Chinook returns to the Columbia Basin in 2023, and there's more on that in our report, especially in Appendix J2. Salmon signals down in California were a little bit more discouraging. This is looking at stoplight tables that we present in the appendix for Klamath River Fall Chinook, Sacramento River Fall Chinook, and now for the first time, Central Valley Spring Chinook. And overall, for fish that went to sea last year, conditions for these different systems were generally pretty negative, especially for Klamath River Fall Chinook and Central Valley Spring Chinook. These are time series that they're compressed here just for visual help, but these time series actually go back to the early and mid 80s. And these are some of the worst conditions collectively in these indicator time sets that we've seen for Klamath River Fall and Central Valley Spring Chinook. And for the Sacramento River, it's a little bit more mixed, but one thing that's definitely consistent through these different sets is very below average freshwater conditions, which Andy hinted at as well, with the low snowpack that translated into lower flows and warmer streams over the course of 2022. Some other notable information that we can provide, switching to some other FMPs for groundfish. For the first time, we were able to include an index of year class strength in this year's report, and the trawl survey data as well as some modeling analysis point to a potentially big incoming year class of sablefish that that's the 2021 cohort. Which you can see compared to some of the other species in the DTS complex. We've seen a big spike here, one of the biggest spikes that we would see on record. And that's consistent also with an environmental indicator that's been proposed for the sablefish assessment. So that's really encouraging that both the data and the indicator were on the same page there. And we're excited about this kind of analysis and interested in applying it potentially to other groundfish species that are suitable for this kind of analysis, like ones that are surveyed well by the Groundfish Bottom Trawl Survey. Highly migratory species, this is a little bit more anecdotal, but we do get the sense, and this is not in the report, but we've heard a lot about high catches of different HMS species over 2022, such as Dorado, and it seems reasonable to conclude that the close proximity of warm water to the productive cells of upwelling that's pictured here and was described by Andy earlier was beneficial for bringing those HMS in nice and close to shore. A few other notable bits of ecological information. Whale entanglement in 2022 remained above those pre-2014 levels, but well off of the peaks of a couple of years ago, perhaps in part thanks to some management actions that have been taken to try to reduce the risk of whale entanglement. And there were no reports in 2022 of entanglement attributed to sablefish fixed gear or to large mesh drift gillnet gear. And then finally, once again, our old nemesis, the pyrosome, was back in 2022, and they actually saw off of Monterey Bay area in scientific surveys the highest catches of pyrosomes that they've seen since sampling began in 1983, even larger than when we first really started to see them boom during the blob, the marine heat wave years of 2014 through 16. So even with some of the cooler water we'd had in previous years and now some of the more mixed conditions this year, we continue to see some of this lingering influence of the initial marine heat wave years in kind of baked into the ecology of the system. Shifting gears again to human activities and well-being, we'll start with good news in the fishing sector from 2022. Commercial landings increased overall by about 11% in 2022 compared to the relatively low levels of the previous 2 years. And those increases were not just in total fishing, but just about across the board for most target groups. Although we should note that those increases were mostly observed in Oregon and California, and Washington had a tougher year in 2022. Recreational landings data are not complete yet, but data that have arrived in the last few weeks since the report was contributed to the briefing book suggests now that 2022 was at least similar to 2021 in terms of recreational landings, and salmon data remain incomplete. Fishery revenue also increased in 2022 for most target groups. It increased by about 10% in 2022 compared to 2021. And again, that was mostly true of fisheries in commercial fisheries in Oregon and California. And this marks consecutive years now of at least 10% revenue increases since the low points of 2020, which could potentially be attributed that low point to impacts of COVID-19. We'll wrap up the human dimensions section by talking about some potential fisheries constraints. We've talked a lot in the past about how fishery diversification has been declining in West Coast vessels over the past several decades across many different ways of classifying vessels in terms of where they fish out of, how large they are, what kind of levels of revenue they pull in. And the general concern is that as the number of target groups that contribute your revenue decline, you could potentially be subjecting yourself to possibly lower overall revenue, higher revenue variability, and decreased resistance to or resilience to shocks. So this trend was basically continued in the most recent year of 2021 with these downward trends. There is, however, more than one way to look at fishery diversification, and we mentioned this in the appendix. There's also temporal diversification, where if you are, instead of looking at the number of target groups you fish, now we're talking about how you spread your effort and your revenue acquisition throughout the year. So now we're talking about the number of weeks and the amount of revenue in those weeks that was acquired over the year. And you can see that the signal here looks very different. For the West Coast fisheries, just about any way you, again, classify your data, temporal diversification actually had been increasing for a long time, for several decades, which could have provided some buffer against the potential limitations of this decrease in diversification by target groups. And this is work that was just published last year. However, our colleague Dan Holland has been updating this work with data since 2015, and actually it's taken a turn. This temporal diversification has started to decrease just as the species or target group diversification has been decreasing. So since 2015, which is potentially coincident with the marine heat waves, some of the closures associated with them, as well as COVID, the number of weeks that boats are out on the water acquiring revenue does seem to be declining. Another potential fisheries constraint that I think we're all very aware of is the potential of spatial overlap with offshore wind energy. And we've introduced some data into our report this year that builds on recent analyses of offshore or of fishing activity and effort in relation to the bottom trawl sector. Now we're expanding that out to quite a few more fisheries to get a sense of what the potential overlap is between fishing effort and fishing revenue with the call areas that are off of Southern Oregon. And this is collaborative work between NIMS and ODFW on a very, very short timetable. So definite kudos to them. Basically, the aggregate indicator of the suitability for offshore wind development so that it reduces potential conflicts with fishing activity shows this heavy band of fishing activity in both call areas, generally between depths of 200 to 500 meters. and some of the more suitable potential areas for offshore wind development that would not conflict as much with fishing are down here in the Brookings area and further offshore. It's important to note that the degree of temporal variability is pretty high in some fisheries, more so than others. Sometimes that variability from year to year in potential overlap is going to be fairly spiky, and in other cases we're seeing trends such as the increase in at-sea whiting and a long-term decrease in groundfish bottom trawl. So this is something that we definitely are going to continue to track as the resolution of these call areas and wind energy areas comes more into focus, and we're also going to be looking at the potential impacts on NIMS surveys. So I'm going to transition back over to Andy for a preview of what we might expect in 2023.
All right. Hello again. Chris, next slide, please. Okay, great. So looking ahead to 2023, we have a couple of different sources. First off, this isn't really a forecast. This is actual data right here on the left. So as everybody's probably aware, we've been getting hammered with some fantastic storms. So as of February 25th, we had huge levels of snowpack, and especially in the Sierras and to the south, but decent amounts all through the Pacific Northwest. But even with that, the drought outlook, which is the map on the lower right, still shows that some of the Southwest is looking towards drought. And this is a little bit like last year when we had the early snowpack, but then headed towards drought. But it's very possible that this may change over the next few weeks as we seem to be continuing to get more and more of this rain and storms coming in. Next slide, please. The next source we can look to is the sort of official NOAA forecast of the probability of El Nino, which is always an important driver of our system here. And what this is basically saying here is that as we transition through the rest of this year, it's almost a certainty that we will not be La Nina and will be either ENSO neutral, which is those gray bars, or we'll even transition to El Nino. So right now, there's not a high likelihood of either one of those. It's going to be one of those two, but we don't know yet which one it will be. They're about equally likely to be either neutral or an actual transition to El Nino. The other large indicator we always look at is the PDO, because when the PDO is negative, that's when we tend to have cool coastal temperatures. And when it's positive, we tend to have those warm coastal temperatures, which are not as favorable. And this map on the right is showing the forecast right now for what the PDO will look like through this coming year. And it's about the same value as it is right now. So it's not going to get, so the forecast is essentially that it will not get, it will not probably transition to the PDO positive phase, which would be bad. So the PDO actually looks like it may stay good. But then again, right now is actually the hardest time to predict the PDO signal. And if we do swing towards more of a positive El Nino ENSO situation, it is more likely that the PDO will essentially also ramp up to higher values. Next slide, please. As far as looking at the heat wave activity, since we had a lot of heat waves this last year, how does that look for the coming year? Well, right now there actually still is quite a large heat wave. So this map on the left is showing there's a heat wave out there. It's actually the same heat wave. It's stuck around. Usually, excuse me, the last few years, the heat wave tends to dissipate in January, February, and then reform. Well, this year it did not. It's still the same heat wave that's out there. And so it's possible it could, recover and gain strength and come back to the coast. And in fact, the map on the upper right is the new tool developed by Mike Jaycox and others to show the sort of probability of heat waves. And it does predict that by this summer, there will still be quite a large heat wave offshore, is the prediction right now. And just a reminder that on top of everything else, we have our long-term trend. And last year was one of the warmest years ever seen in the ocean. And that trend is continuing. We don't see an end to that overall warming trend. Next slide, please. And then thanks very much to the folks that provide the JScope forecast. So this is a look at a smaller region, but it basically backs up what we're saying with the overall picture, is that sea surface temperatures are likely to be warmer than normal during spring, late spring and summer as we head through the year. Next slide. Similarly, JScope is also forecasting lower than oxygen through the summer for most of the coastal regions. Uh, Next slide, please. Oh, okay, that's that. That's it. I thought we had one more, but that's the end. So that is the end for just the physical outlook for next year, and I'll hand it back to Chris one more time to bring us on home.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So just to summarize, ecologically, 2022 was, we're calling it a mix of met and unmet expectations. We saw basin scale drivers that foretold a good story for ecosystem productivity. And that played out more in the central and south than it did in the north of the system. Local upwelling and downwelling and a major marine heat wave played big roles in that picture. But also there's some inertia in the food web from lag effects from previous years and good conditions in previous years, as well as some surprising or resilient species. And at the top of the list of surprising species is the continuing boom of anchovy. Fishery landings and revenue overall improved in 2022 across several different target groups, particularly in California and Oregon. We also now feel like we have a better understanding of the potential overlap with offshore wind energy development off of Oregon. Fishery diversification has declined for both target groups and the number of weeks on the water. And so that's something that we're identifying as a potential point of concern and constraint. And finally, in 2023, we're expecting potentially ENSO neutral or even possibly positive conditions and more heat from that heat wave. We've talked a little bit about how there seems to be some mismatch or decoupling of the basin scale factors and the local scale factors that drive the production in the ecosystem. And we definitely are seeing throughout the world and also in the North Pacific that climate change does seem to be leading to more of these kinds of mismatches and decouplings between expectations and observations from different environmental drivers. And so that just harkens to the climate change appendix conversation that has started in recent council meetings and that we introduced in our last year's report and continue in this year's report. And we just want to highlight that, again, that this is a conversation. We're really anxious to hear impressions from folks in the council community, the different advisory bodies in particular, about what kinds of information you'd most likely like to see in there that might support your work with your particular FMP or other considerations. The goal of that appendix is to help use and develop indices that can provide some credible and skilled forecasts with good ideas of the confidence under them for different ecosystem properties, and to reduce some of these apparent statistical mismatches with explanations that are based on mechanisms. So part of our ongoing conversation with you is continuing to develop and figure out which indices we have that could be used toward meeting that goal, how we might operationalize them into actual forecasts that are useful in the council process, and which ones of those we start to integrate into the ecosystem status report. And then lastly, we'll just say that this is our first, I think, official chance to say on record that we are in the Ecosystem Status Report group quite enthusiastic about FEP Initiative 4. We see it as obviously a very clear parallel to the ESR. The ESR remains a document that's intended to be used for broad context, but there's so much similar kinds of information that we produce in the ESR that we could imagine going into something like the ecosystems column of a risk table that might be developed under Initiative 4 for use in harvest management. And we have definitely a lot of ideas and expertise around this, and are looking forward to sharing whatever we can about the ways that we've screened indicators, developed stoplights, and conducted some other kinds of advanced data analyses, as well as the tools and concepts that are outlined and being developed in the climate change appendix, so that we can support that effort as best we can, provided that, of course, that we can ensure some complementarity and manageable workloads for analysts that are likely to be involved in both efforts. And, ultimately, we think that as much as we can contribute to Initiative 4, Initiative 4 is very likely to contribute ideas back to us and help us align and improve future ESRs for the Council. And so that concludes our presentation. We really appreciate and thank you for your attention, and we look forward to questions.
Okay, thanks, Chris and Andy. Just a reminder, folks that may have joined late, please use the raise hand feature if you want to ask a question. It's a little bit hidden in this version of the webinar platform. It's under reactions. So click on the reactions button there along the bottom of your webinar screen, and you should see the raise hand inside there. So we got a question.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just learning to navigate this too. I see Greg Krutzikowski. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay.
Yes, loud and clear.
I just wanted to point out, perhaps you misspoke, but when you talked about the whale entanglement, you said that whale entanglements themselves had decreased. And what your metric is not true whale entanglements. It's confirmed reports. And there is a huge difference between the two. And I think that everyone needs to be aware of that difference. It's only what is a confirmed report that you guys are getting. And that is a reasonable metric, but unfortunately, it doesn't really have a good denominator. So it's not really a very standardized sort of report there.
Thanks, Greg. Totally agree. That's a very good catch on your part, and I will use more precise language in the slide and in the presentation. But there are certainly, as you point out, multiple factors that contribute to, of course, whether a whale gets entangled in the first place, but definitely whether that entanglement gets observed and reported or not. So, thank you very much for the comment.
And let me just say, you guys did a great job. Don't get me wrong. It's fantastic work, and I really appreciate seeing it. Just a minor point. Thanks.
No, thank you, Greg. And no need to, the comments like this are constructive, appreciated, and they make the report better. So thanks very much for commenting.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I guess I'll give this. Oh, I see a hand from Scott. So
yeah, there's a bunch of questions. Would you like me to shuttle questions to Andy and Chris?
Okay. Sure. That would be helpful because I'm not seeing all the raised hands. So
let's start with Whitney Roberts, who looks like the first person to raise a hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Yvonne. And thanks, Andrew and Chris, for this great presentation. I also echo the appreciation for the month by month. I thought that was really interesting. My question was about the fishery diversification component. And I noticed that you all focused, and I apologize, I haven't read the report yet, gotten to it, but the focus seemed to be on target groups or target species. But I guess from the perspective of the groundfish management team, there seems to be a growing interest in the ability or opportunity for incidental catches along with the target species for particular vessels in terms of, maximizing profits and addressing, dips in the target species or constraints going on. And so I'm interested if there is any consideration to different ways of defining diversification and not just focusing on target species or target groups, but also thinking about how one vessel might diversify the species that they catch in addition to target species to hopefully optimize opportunity and marketability and profits.
Thanks, Whitney. So maybe just a point of order before I say anything, because I certainly was not the analyst here. Kit, is it okay to welcome input from other participants on the call who actually were hands-on analysts for this?
Yeah, sure. No problem there.
Okay. So if Dan Holland is willing to unmute and able to unmute
I
and
can
speak
unmute.
to
Can you
this,
hear me?
I would definitely yield to his expertise.
Yeah, I'm not
because
sure if I completely understood the point there.
If he's unable to unmute, I will.
The way that
take
these
at least
indices are constructed
swipe at it.
is simply is looking at the revenue that is generated for a vessel
Yes, loud
from
and clear, Dan.
different
Thank you.
species groups. So species groups being like groundfish is one species group, salmon. Some groups are just single species like Dungeness crab. And so it's looking at how spread out the income vessels that are in the fishery over time, in how that revenue is spread across different species groups. The same time we saw until about 2014 or so, people were spreading their revenue on average, spreading their revenue out more across the year, and which correlated with fishing more weeks of the year. And that may have been because some fisheries that went to limited access had fewer people in them and longer seasons. But the trend for that type of diversification declined since 2014, and that may have to do with particularly with salmon and crab seasons being more compressed in some areas. So if that's not answered the question, maybe you could restate it and see where I'm missing it.
I think that's sufficient, Dan. Thank you. It was the word target on the slide that I think triggered it for me in terms of wondering how that index was calculated. But it
You're
sounds
correct.
like
target has nothing really to do with it. It just has to do with what they're actually catching in various species groups.
All species groups, and not necessarily defining what was a target species for any one vessel or not. Am I correct? Okay, great. Thank you, Dan.
And thank you. I'll fix the wording on that slide so that it's more clear.
Thank you, everyone. That was a helpful conversation. I've also been curious about that index. I think it's very difficult to figure out how to do this kind of work in a highly biodiverse ecosystem like ours. So let's see, Bill Seidemann, you're up next, please.
Okay, I'll just echo the others that was a great presentation, and really enjoyed the month-by-month approach. I thought it was quite revealing, and we know that there's this within year variation, and oftentimes we kind of gloss over that. So congratulations on making that decision. I guess I had a couple of points at the basin scale, and to the question about climate change at the end. The PDO of now is not the PDO of the past. And there was a recent paper by Rudnick, and I can't remember who the first author was offhand, where it really looked like the last decade, basically it's just warm. So the PDO is stuck in this new phase, and the first empirical orthogonal function does not explain as much of the variance as it used to, and all these kinds of changes. So, that's one question, is, can we start to get at they suggested that the PDO is really not the climate indicator that it used to be. Now, maybe it actually is, but you guys thought about that at all? I think it's a question for Andy.
Bill, I totally agree with you actually on that. So I don't know if you saw, I think it was Di Lorenzo's paper from a few years ago with a student or something, where they were looking at the independence of PDO and NPGO and those things, and the idea is that they're actually becoming they're not as independent. So yeah, they're maybe not as good an indicator. My feeling on it too is that when we have the heat waves at different seasons, that kind of swamps out the normal PDO signal as well. So yeah, I'd say the PDO is somewhat less reliable indicator as we go forward. But I believe that still, the other indicators like ENSO is still very useful. So yeah, I mean, we're not going to ignore them. They're just, it's just that we're not going to stick as much to our predictions, or at least we're going to be more aware of looking for differences from what we might predict. And again, like you said, looking at it over the course of the year and not just one, not just one number for the whole year, right? But looking at it temporally, how it evolves, it's pretty important. And it was really important this year to see how the temporal evolution came, as hopefully we showed in those figures. So.
Yeah, you did a great job with that. So kind of the second question, which is related, is about upwelling. And I noticed you had a number of curves that showed, the temporal progression of upwelling and, through the year in different regions. But then you also said there was active downwelling. And was that actually, was there really active downwelling, or was it really just a series of, shorter term upwelling events that led to greater periods of relaxation?
No, I would say it was the first. There really was strong, because of the winds. It wasn't just a relaxation. So in previous years, you'd get those relaxations, okay? But this year we actually had full on, northward blowing winds. So not just an anomalous, decrease, but full on northward blowing winds that had to be causing some downwelling. And they lasted, Bill, for longer periods of time than in the past. And it was all related to those few big storms that came through. We had, 5 or 6 times during the year when those sort of really low pressure cells were up in the Northwest. And I guess that's not something, I'm not a full atmosphere guy, but people that know the atmosphere really well, they said that was pretty unusual situation. And so, yeah, you can, that's a great picture of it. Those, if you can even see the little blue arrows are full on from from Northern California north, actually just pointing north.
Yeah.
That's not something we see in other years. So, and those were lasting from a week to almost 2 weeks, a few of those events. Again, very unusual for relaxation events to last that long. Yeah. And so I think that's why we got kind of hammered, especially basically from Oregon on up. You notice that even when this cell came in, though, the sort of North California to central and south, the winds were actually still going the right way, though. So we were still having upwelling in the south because of the location of the North Pacific High, if you can make it out on that particular map. So, yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I go one more? The other is, no, you didn't comment about sardine, and I just wonder, Chris, what's the sardine story?
Thanks, Bill. As far as I know from both the forage surveys of just the small net surveys, including the larval surveys from Cal Coffee, as well as the CPS survey, the sardine story looks like it remains fairly unchanged from recent years. So it doesn't look like we've had a recruitment event of them that should be righting the ship for the sardine population, at least the northern stock.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that dive there. Let's see. So Doug Fricke, you are up next, followed by Scott McMullen.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please go
This is
ahead.
probably primarily for Chris. I'm a retired albacore fisherman, and you didn't say much about albacore this year as you have in the past. This year we had a resurgence after 3 really poor years of harvest in our landings. And I know you've been doing stomach analysis for quite a few years now. Is there any conclusion on what seems to be the best prey out there for them, for the albacore to be available to our surface fleets? One question. And number 2 is, do you have any projections of what we'll be looking for in 2023 and beyond, if you've identified this particular prey species that seems to encourage successful surface fishery?
Thanks a lot, Doug. I'll do the best I can. This feels like both something that I might have to get back to you on at the earliest convenience after talking with some of those folks, as well as just a reminder for us to be as on top of HMS and future reports as we can. I will say there have not been new stomachs from 2022 analyzed yet. They are on the waiting list, but the analysts were still completing the stomach analyses from 2021 as of just this last year. And as I recall, I don't, well, let me see if I can just scroll it up real quick. Definitely krill were one of the main parts of the albacore diet, and these were samples that were collected in the fishery. And let me see if I can just find it real quick. I appreciate your patience.
Chris, if you go to slide 49, I stuck it in for
Okay,
you.
and Pacific Sowery are another one that has been trending up, and they continue to sneak in some young of the year rockfish when possible. As far as conditions that might be in the offing, that's something that it would be definitely better for me to talk with our colleagues at the Southwest Center about, who are focused on HMS ecology. I will just mention that from what Andy talked about in terms of potential shift into more ENSO neutral conditions, as well as an offshore heat wave that has never gone away, the prospect for warm water to be fairly close to the coast in 2023 seems pretty reasonable. But whether that's going to lead to foraging opportunities based on local upwelling cells that manage to persist through that, we'll just have to see. I'm sure that's not a satisfactory answer, Doug, but I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Scott McMullen, you're next, followed by Jessica Watson.
Scam.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent presentation. The month by month was really helpful. In March, you mentioned the highest number of copepods were seen. And then by June, it sounded like the copepods had left. And is there, what do we know from people in the field happened to them? Did the conditions change and they die, consumed, unavailable, moved further offshore? Is there any kind of indication what happened to that mass of copepods?
That is a great question. I wouldn't want to speculate on that. I don't know if somebody from the Newport line is on here that might be able to address that directly. If they are, they could speak up. Scott, my knowledge, though, somewhat limited knowledge of the system, would be that they were actually probably both died. They died. They may have also gone into dormancy. So these copepods go dormant and go really deep. So they may have gone dormant, gone deep, and left the surface if things weren't great for them. And they could also be transported out of the region. So you saw on some of the maps during those really strong sort of downwelling periods, the actual location of the bifurcation of the current as it comes across and hits the coast was much farther south this year than it would be in other years because of the large scale wind pattern. So it's very possible they were transported out of the region somewhat. So there's a couple of different things that could be going on, but more specifics if somebody's on here from Newport can answer, or I can ask them and get back to you if you'd like. But I don't want to speculate any more than that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And I just wanted to comment that I love the pictures of the copepods this year, and particularly appreciated the pointing out of the fatty bit. It just brings the whole like hamburger concept home. So Jessica Watson, you're up next, followed by Mike Okoniewski.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Thanks again for this great presentation, per usual. My question is around the offshore wind. You mentioned when presenting the fishery relative ranked importance data that you also looked at impacts to research surveys. And I was wondering if you could describe any analysis you've done on the impacts and how that might affect reporting like this in the future.
Thanks, Jessica. As far as I know, the main point so far has just been really to inventory all of the survey tracks from different NIMS surveys that go through the call areas. I do know that there is going to be ongoing work on not just that a survey vessel sailed through there at some point over the last several years, but also the type and the information content of data that were taken on those surveys. There's going to be a fair amount of effort, but it's clear, I think, among all the people involved in those surveys that it's essential effort for both potential information costs as well as thinking about how the survey might need to be potentially redesigned if wind projects go in there. But as far as I know, it's mainly in the inventory stage and just the earliest stages of analysis of information content.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jessica and Chris. Mike Okoniewski, followed by Deb Wilson-Vandenberg.
Yeah, I think it was Whitney Roberts that had the question about the adding in maybe what would be an incidental catch species and attempting to make more revenue on that. And I just I'm retired now, but spent a lot of time, 53 years actually, in the fishing industry, processing and working with sales teams. There's a big difference now compared to what it was, say, even 20 years ago, as far as what the way the market looks. And one is just the consolidation that's had in the retail chains, and everything goes through, big warehouses as opposed to delivery to individual stores. And then the influence of imports. But it seems like, in general, there's a lot of product that I'd say English sole, sand dabs, Rex sole, and other items that have just, they're kind of a novelty that these bigger chains don't like to deal with anymore. And I don't, to answer the question though, I'm thinking and see if there's, which there should be, outlets for these fish. I think that looking at the marketing side is a must, because these changes have affected, I believe, the the amount of fish we can get out of the ocean that's going to be usable, or at least the number of species. Petrale and Dover, the big ones, for flatfish. So, but that change is also makes it easier for the chain stores or retail chain stores to inventory and get a few items that the guys behind the counter are at least familiar with, as opposed to other items that they don't know about, taste profiles and things like that. So it gets a little more involved, and I don't think there's been much research put into it I know Positively Groundfish has done an amazing amount of research for the size of their operation. And some of that I've listened to, and it's pretty telling. Ethnic diversity also plays into this, I think, especially on the West Coast and California. So that's just my observations anyway. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Let's see. Deb Wilson-Vandenberg, you're up next, followed by Arlene Merriams. And then if no one else has hands after that, I'm going to invite Chris and Andy to comment to us if there are any appendices that you think are particularly interesting that you want to draw our attention to, because one of the big secrets of the ecosystem status report, it's not a secret really, is that the report itself is short, but the appendices are long. So if you want us to take a look at any of those in particular, I'd appreciate hearing about it. But first, questions from Deb and then Arlene. Go ahead, Deb.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, first I want to thank the whole team for doing such another great report. Really liked it. And I also really liked the month-to-month start to it. It really helped conceptualize kind of what was going on in the ocean with what was going on with the rest of the ecosystem. And I really want to thank Yvonne for reminding me how to raise my hand, because that helped. My question was for Andy, and it had to do with the tail end predictions for 2023. And that was, it looked to me, if I recall correctly, that the JScope information that you provided was primarily for Washington and Oregon, but your statements sounded like they were for the whole coast. So if I missed something there, I apologize. But I just wanted to check that the statements did reflect the whole coast rather than what I was seeing in the figures, I thought.
Yeah. JScope is just Oregon, Washington. My comment there was that is just, it's consistent with the idea that it will be warmer. Again, it's hard to say, will that also extend to the south? But the only prediction we have right now is just that there will be the offshore heat wave. Looks more likely than not. Yep, from that picture, and that's throughout the whole West Coast. So whether we have a sort of repeat of this last year or something different, that's not really well known. But we do at least have the JScope, which shows us, at least for the north, yes, the coastal waters are predicted to be warmer. But remember, again, this is a prediction started when you make these predictions from January. That's actually the hardest time to do that. So you might want to look at the predictions that come up that get initialized in April this year to have a better sense of how the rest of the year will unfold for the summer and the fall. The predictions made based on January are always the most difficult ones to do. And predictions based on when we're in a transition phase from La Nina towards neutral or ENSO are also some of the trickiest ones and have the least confidence in them.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess we'll all be trying to dust off our crystal balls a little better.
Yes, it is.
I did want to thank Mike O for his statements on the fishery diversity, because I know every time I go on my Costco and try and understand why they have only rockfish from Canada, I have feelings that I understand why that is. But relative to the diversity indices that Dan, you helped elucidate a little further, I think my question that had come up from our groundfish team person, that I don't recall who it was, to me, the way I thought of that question is, and I know how challenging these are to come up with to begin with, but I guess I question how valid it is, or is it really valid and fair to compare diversification in things like salmon fisheries or Dungeness crab with something like groundfish, which has, tens and 20s of species in that whole category? And could you be getting a different trend in diversity within the category
Okay, if I respond to that, Chris?
than what you're seeing when you're comparing it with the other groups?
Just want to clarify
So
that, yeah, so
presumably
basically
would be a lot more
groundfish is
analysis,
treated as
but
if
I
it's a
kind of
single
felt like it
species
might
in a
get
sense,
to
really,
part of
other
what
than
Marco
whiting
was
in these
talking
indices.
about. And I'll
So
just
groundfish,
hang
all the
up and leave
salmon
it
are
there.
combined as if it was as a species group.
Sure, go for it, Dan.
That is something that we could look at, but it would not be demonstrated in these indices.
Thank you. Let's see, Arlene Merrims is up next with a question.
Yes, hello, and thank you. I echo what everyone else said. The report and the presentation are great, and I especially appreciate the visuals. So my question that I had put in the chat was about something from the appendix that was also in the Habitat report in our briefing book, which is about the couple of the indicators for this Sacramento and Klamath fall Chinook. And what was just mentioned briefly was that brood year updates for the egg fry indicators can no longer be included in the ecosystem status report. And also the seabird predation indicator could no longer be updated. So I was just curious to know a little bit more about that. It didn't really go into detail in the appendix.
Well, I can thank you, Arlene. I can comment more directly for the bird predation index than I can on the egg one. I'll have to just go back and check with Corey Green and others in the Habitat Committee about the specifics there. Apologize for not knowing that off the top of my head. The bird predation one is mainly just due to a data sharing agreement. We have used that qualitatively, at least to say, in the stoplight table for Central Valley fall Chinook that's in the main body of the report, that the relatively simple one with just like 4 or 5 cells in it, we can qualitatively look at data and say, that it looks like predation by common murres in the Farallon Islands on juvenile Chinook salmon was low. The reason it can't be used in these, so saying it's low, that's qualitative. We can't use it in these tables because they're actually using rankings and statistics to assign numbers into the cells, and low isn't a number. So it really is just a matter of this data sharing agreement that blocks that one from having a color assigned to it. I would think that the amount of predation buffering being offered by anchovy right now for Chinook that are going out to sea in this area probably is protecting them a bit from common murre predation. So hopefully that's not a big loss. I'll have to look at the egg to fry one that you asked about.
Thank you. And yeah, excuse me, I'm on the Habitat Committee, so
Thanks,
I'm sure we'll talk
Yvonne.
about it with Corey
Thanks,
during the
Chris
meeting, and we'll
and
see you
Andy,
there as
for
well.
the fantastic
Thanks so much.
presentation, and thanks to the
Thank you, Arlene.
IBA team
We
for
have
another
question
great
from Michelle Conrad.
ecosystem status report. My question is with regard to the climate change appendix, Chris, and enthusiasm about Initiative 4, and also the tools and concepts that were outlined in the climate change appendix this year, but also noted that in the climate change appendix, there was reference to having limited resources at the science centers and the need for collaboration, if not additional funding for more resources to really bring Initiative 4 to reality and accomplishing all of the objectives that are outlined there. And just wanted to know if you could speak to that a little bit more as we look ahead to the Initiative 4 and the report from the Ecosystem Working Group, and just wondering what the limitations are relative to expanding the demonstration species, for example.
So this is Yvonne, and I will just say that I don't be happy to have Chris and Andy respond, but wanted to comment that I don't think that they've been involved in conversations about resources internally. So just wanted to note that, and also note for people who are listening that we're going to be talking about Initiative 4 this afternoon. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris, Andy.
Yeah, well, I'll just say also just being very clear that that Andy and I are federal employees. We probably need to be quite careful about advocating for for any kind of funding support so that we don't breach protocol. I think really what would be important for us to just think about going forward, though, is just what I mentioned before, that there's a fair number of people that are working on the ecosystem status report that I think also in parallel, the climate change appendix is evolving in parallel to work that people are already doing on developing these models and developing these forward-looking indices and building confidence and skill in them. Some of those partnerships are academic partnerships, and it's a lot harder for us to control, how capability and capacity changes in those. And then for those of us who work on the ecosystem status report that might be called upon to support the effort of something in FEP Initiative 4 that is, like I said here, parallel to, but also distinct from the ecosystem status report, because ecosystem status report's in that context lane, and Initiative 4 is more in the harvest policy lane. And we're in something of a zero-sum game where if someone is working on one thing, they might not be as able to work on another, and we just want to make sure that we're being open-eyed and balanced about how much time and workload is there for different people that might be working on one or the other. As far as other species, like pilot species, yeah, maybe like Yvonne was mentioning, ones that we already have a lot of information in the fold for, that may have come through parallel research that's either in the climate change appendix or elsewhere, in the ESR's orbit. Just because we have research going on them might not necessarily mean they're a good candidate for the initiative. I'm thinking of something like sardine that has a lot of research published on it from back in the early part of the 2010s, but then on the other hand, there's not a sardine fishery right now. So
thank
whether
you,
that,
Yvonne, also
those kinds of
for your
considerations
comments.
are definitely ones that I think we're more waiting to hear how we can help, rather than on the decision
also,
side of
Chris, around
the table.
advocating for help or collaboration. But I guess the take-home message that I got from the climate change appendix and what you've described here is that there's some great parallels to the ESR from FEP Initiative 4, but basically the work that's described in the climate change appendix in order to achieve the objectives of FEP Initiative 4 would be new work essentially for the science centers. And that would have to be built in relative to current workloads and other work that's ongoing for the ESR. Is that a fair characterization?
That seems fair. There could be some shovel-ready things in there. It'll just depend on the species and probably the time frame within which that information might be needed, but that seems like a pretty fair statement.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to draw Chris and Andy's attention to the written chat comment from Anna Weinstein, where she asks if the team has access to the unstandardized Farallon's seabird data.
I don't know. We will have to talk about that with our bird point person. That does not ring a bell to me, so I will definitely follow up on that. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. All right, I am looking at the participants list and I do not see any blue hands. So I'm just going to remind everyone, if you would like to raise your blue hand, you click on the reactions button at the bottom bar, and then you'll see a blue raise hand feature being the top clickable item in that set of reactions. And with that, I would be curious to know if Chris and Andy have any favorite appendices they'd like to point out for us, or sort of interesting thoughts in the appendices that they want to share. Thank you.
Andy, why don't you go first?
Yeah, as far as the appendices, I think there was a few people made a comment here or there about the saturation state for like basically ocean pH, and I just want to note we do have some figures on that. I believe in the appendix, probably in the physical and climate section. So we have that, and then again we're talking a bunch about the climate change appendix. So I'd suggest if people want to learn more about our thoughts on model forecasts and how those might fit into the future reports, that's a great place to look there. We're sort of developing a sort of ongoing conversation in the chapter from last year and then the chapter this year, these appendixes, I mean. Talking about that, one of the questions we got to during the presentation or at the end there was asking about the JScope forecasting. And so I talk about that a little bit again in the climate change appendix about how we might start incorporating more of those kinds of models into the ESR. So those are the only things I have to really just note for people. Chris, how about you?
Thanks, Andy. So a couple of things that come to mind for me, and appreciate the opportunity, Yvonne. One is Appendix J is the salmon appendix that includes much more detailed and long-term pictures of those new stoplight tables. Arlene asked a question about that referenced some of that, and the Habitat Committee and partners within and around it have put really an awful lot of work into that, and a lot of thought into what constitutes an informative indicator for those populations, and have added the spring Chinook table as well. And also in that appendix is a look at how taking all of those little colored cells and all that information that could, a lot of those things could be basically saying pretty much the same thing. So which one of them is the most influential indicator? Well, the first part of that appendix is more detailed work on how we are working on converting those stoplight tables into more quantitative information that can be used for indicator-driven outlooks. Brian Burke has been working on that from the Northwest Center, mainly for the Columbia Basin Chinook, and this was improved an awful lot. This whole analysis and those appendixes was approved an awful lot by our interaction with the SSC Ecosystem Subcommittee last September. So I would definitely point to that. And I don't have it at my fingertips, so I forget which exact appendix it is, but toward the end of the report is the appendix on the offshore wind potential for overlap with different fisheries, and that contains lots of maps that are customized to specific fisheries. There's 9 different fisheries, and I think including some recreational ones, like recreational albacore, I think is in there too. Thank you, Yvonne. Appendix Q has all that information. I want to point that out both just because it's, it extended the length of the report for sure, because there's so many maps in there, but they're really rich information sources and also reflect, I think, just a terrific amount of really good partnership between our folks and the state of Oregon agency and agencies, and also especially ODFW, and also just work on a really fast moving issue that we need to be as out in front of as possible, as per the lessons that have been learned on the East Coast, I think. This was I think just a outstanding amount of effort that's yielded some information that I think is really digestible. So I would point there too. And I think I'll call it good there, Yvonne. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to say that just from I'm glad you picked those 2. There are other awesome appendices, but I really love the salmon appendix in particular. And, I hope that everyone on this call who's very ocean focused, but who has colleagues who are terrestrially focused or more, salmon inland focused, will take a chance to point out this report to their salmon-y colleagues who work more on the land side, so that they can see some of the information that's available. And because the Fishery Management Council is very fortunate to have set up this process where they have this annual report on the ecosystem status from the science centers, and we're fortunate to have the science centers respond as thoroughly and well as they do. And I don't know that other groups of folks actually understand what all is available out there and how interesting and useful this report is. So with that, I'm going to mumble for a minute or 2 and just make sure that there are no more blue hands and no more chats. Okay. Okay. Great. So thank you. Arlene pointed out, and Kit, I'll let you close out if you'd like, but I know Kit recorded this webinar so that it can be viewed by other people. And of course, the luxury of that is you can speed it up as much as you like, or slow it down, or stop and start as you go. And I think Kit's intent is to post it on the council website so that anyone who missed this morning's briefing will have an opportunity to listen in. So Kit, do you have any final thoughts before we adjourn for the day? Thank you, Kit. So today, let me start by sharing my screen, make sure I can do this. Okay. Does everyone see a full screen version of a PowerPoint presentation titled Agenda Item H2? And I can't see the controls on Ring Central, so if you could please respond by voice, that would be helpful. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Just sometimes, when you're making these presentations, you're sort of flying blind. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm going to be providing a briefing on the Ecosystem Work Group report for agenda item H2, the Fishery Ecosystem Plans Ecosystem and Climate Information Initiative. You'll find our report in the Council's March 2023 briefing book. So this is the Council's fourth ecosystem initiative, and it's intended to follow three basic steps. First, reviewing the incorporation of ecosystem and climate information.
I think you're muted, Yvonne.
Okay, so start over from the beginning. May I start from this slide or the prior slide? Okay. Okay. So, well, it was not a very exciting slide because I basically read the information that's on the slide. So this ecosystem initiative is a three-step process, and it would review the incorporation of ecosystem and climate information in the Council's harvest setting and fisheries management processes, determine the need and timing for additional FMP-specific ecosystem and climate information, and where there is a need for additional information, develop clear pathways for that information to be used in the setting of scientific uncertainty and harvest policy. So right now, and as described this morning, we have a process where the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team brings us an annual ecosystem status report. And when the Council and its advisory bodies receive those reports, that process generates additional new ideas for future work. Those discussions also generate side conversations about using information in the ecosystem status report in various other parts of the management process. For example, ecosystem report contributors have been refining and updating those familiar stoplight tables that give salmon fisheries managers a more clear picture of the state of the physical environment and its potential effects on the suites of salmon stocks in different sections of the coast. This initiative particularly asks us to look for ecosystem and climate information that may be useful for harvest setting and annual and biennial management processes. The Council has already recommended, supported, requested the use of ecosystem information in stock assessments where possible. And if folks would mute from their ends, please. Both the groundfish and coastal pelagic species stock assessment terms of reference ask that their stock assessment review processes look for opportunities to bring ecosystem information into those stock assessments. With those terms of reference in place, the Council has already taken what action it can on the policy side to support inclusion of ecosystem and climate information in stock assessments. So the Ecosystem Work Group has been looking at the science and policy space that follows stock assessments, the Council's risk policy. One example of a Council advisory body using ecosystem status report information to try to address the Council's risk policy comes from this June 2022 report of the Coastal Pelagic Species Management Team, where the CPS-MT noted the generally favorable ecosystem indicators for the central subpopulation in northern anchovy and recommended a catch limit based on the status of the stock and ecosystem information. While the Council ultimately didn't adopt the CPS-MT's recommendation, the team was laying a path for the broader Council family to understand how ecosystem information could be used to address risk in harvest setting. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council and the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council have used more formal processes. In the North Pacific, they provide a general risk table that shows differing levels of concern over stock status under different categories of information, including environmental and ecosystem information. And Drs. Harvey and Lysing showed a sort of West Coast version of that earlier today. So the 2020 Dorn and Zador article that describes this process also provides a species-specific risk table that uses information categories from the first table to evaluate risk in setting harvest levels for Gulf of Alaska pollock. For September 2023, the Ecosystem Work Group is proposing that we provide the Council with a draft risk classification table tailored to our ecosystem and stock assessment process, and a pilot risk evaluation table for Petrale sole. I know that it's impossible to hope to contain worrying, but I want to emphasize that we chose Petrale sole for a pilot species because it's an information-rich species. In other words, there's existing work that looks at the effects of climate conditions on the Petrale sole stock. We don't think that Petrale sole is in some new jeopardy or particularly vulnerable to climate change. Its boringness is in part what makes it a useful example. When the Council gets to actually choosing a species group or species to be subject to ecosystem and climate information reports, our plan for this initiative is that the Council would evaluate its managed species groups and species using ecological criteria, economic criteria, and management criteria. We hope the Council will move forward with seeking new information on species or stock groups, so above the single species level, but below the fishery management plan level. For this March 2023 meeting, we hope to receive suggestions on these species group evaluation criteria summarized on the screen and found on pages 6 and 7 of our report. And for September 2023, we would turn those suggestions into a draft table for Council review, ultimately intended for the Council to use to choose future species groups to be evaluated in the risk tables. So the goal here is not to choose all the different species groups the Council will address in order over the next 10 to 20 years, but instead to set up an ongoing process that the Council can then use to recommend future species groups for its focus, similar to the stock assessment planning process. So which stock assessments are coming up next, and we would follow created process for which stocks or species groups would be subject to next ecosystem and climate information. For the Council to use ecosystem information, harvest setting, and in-season, annual, or biennial management measures, we need to look at those processes for the most opportune times to make that information available. Section 3 of our report includes this snapshot table of the timing of those processes in the 4 fishery management plans. But we provide the details on those processes in Appendix A. For this March 2023 meeting, we would appreciate it if the species-specific advisory bodies would review their appropriate sections of Appendix A and look for needed corrections. I will say that I hope that this ask is not so big because the FMP experts from the Council staff have already reviewed Appendix A. We're expecting subtle comments, not, hopefully no wild inaccuracies are in there. The third step in the initiative is to develop policy pathways for the Council to use ecosystem and climate information in understanding scientific uncertainty in its harvest setting processes. Some of my colleagues within the agency like to talk about finding what they call management on-ramps for bringing ecosystem science into the management process. This initiative is about recognizing that there may not be pre-existing on-ramps, that we may have to build them. To ensure that this initiative has clear end goals and products, we are recommending that the Council consider this initiative complete when it has adopted and implemented an ongoing process for choosing new species to be subject to ecosystem and climate information products, and ensure that advisory bodies have future opportunities and processes for conferring with ecosystem scientists on the potential contents of those reports. So this is not an open-ended initiative tended to go on until we've finished all of our 100 plus species. It's an initiative to set up processes that will hopefully continue to allow new species to be addressed. I'd just like to close by saying that the start of an ecosystem initiative is always sort of messy, and it takes a while for the process to shake out. However, our ecosystem initiatives are having some amazing ripple effects over time. The first initiative on unfished forage fish species inspired our scientists to include an ongoing focus on the forage base in the annual ecosystem status report. And that annual report, coupled with our second initiative on reviewing and refining the ecosystem status report, created a deeply educated council family and fishing public who engaged in the climate change scenario planning process of the third initiative. And now we're seeing that the council's work on the forage base inspired some amazing work led by the Southwest Fisheries Science Center to modernize West Coast diet data into the California Current Trophic Database. New publications are going to start coming out soon on the work in that database, and who knows where that science is going to lead us on future initiatives and policy efforts. So with that, I will just close by saying that the Ecosystem Work Group will be meeting next Monday, the 6th, at the council's meeting in South Seattle. The council will be discussing ecosystem agenda items, both the ecosystem status report and this initiative on Tuesday, March 7th. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see what's going on in the Ring Central controls. Thank you. Does anyone from the Ecosystem Work Group have any comments that they'd like to make to sort of further elucidate and describe the initiative? And it's fine if you don't. If anyone has any questions, please remember to click on the reactions button in the lower bar and raise your blue hand.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks, Yvonne, and thanks, Kit. I think maybe my first question, because I have a couple, is in reading the report, and I understand having the Petrali be a pilot. So is the GMT, does this envision the GMT being provided the information that would that we would evaluate against this risk table? Or is our role to figure out like how to apply that and make a recommendation to the council? I guess maybe a process question there.
Thanks, Lorna. I appreciate the question. So our hope is to work with the GMT and the GAP. We hope that it's not more than a 1 to 2 hour meeting this spring, and just talk with you guys about if we were to set up a set of risk tables similar to those used in the North Pacific, whether how we might perceive Petrali sole fitting into those risk tables. So, and we also want to check, particularly with the GMT, on the management process itself for groundfish to see going forward, if we bring ecosystem information into the council process on groundfish, what point in the biennial management cycle is the optimal point for bringing that information in? So we're just in exploratory phase, and as I said, Petrali, just a pilot. and hopefully can serve to help others think about different groups of species going forward. We could have just as easily, created some fictional species, but it seems silly to do that when you have something that's ready to hand and some good research. So I'm not sure if that fully answered your question on GMT involvement, but I hope it's to help us, sort of figure out how this is all going to work together in the councils, in the groundfish management process.
Yeah, no, thanks, Yvonne. I think that partly does. So this work session would just be to look at, so are you saying that we'd use the North Pacific risk table with potentially changes, but at least for now we'll use that and then essentially run trolley through that filter? That's what we would be doing at this meeting that you're proposing for spring?
I think that would be a good first step, and I would maybe defer to some folks from the science centers on the ecosystem work group if they have other ideas. But imagine that the Dorn and Zadar table is that's the table that goes, table one that goes up on the whiteboard, and then we all scratch out sections we don't like and revise, and then come up with a more PFMC appropriate table, and then evaluate Petrali from there.
Against that. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
And I think that I just, I emphasize the Dorn and Zadar table in the presentation because it's pretty clear and straightforward. But I will say that in our report, we reference some work from the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and they've got, sort of much bigger and complex risk assessment reporting that we can, not that I'm advocating large and complex, more resources to draw from.
Okay.
Thanks, Kit. You guys are taking advisory body questions at this point, right?
Yes.
Because that's me. Okay, thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, thank you for being clear about what you're looking for, advice from the council advisory body. So I had a couple of questions on that, just so I understand going forward into our meeting tomorrow. So as far as picking preferred methods or priorities for grouping council managed species together, so would it be, is it kind of like any and all ideas there, or is it specifically like you guys already laid out, kinds of the groups, the course criteria, ecosystem, management needs. So, we coastal pelagics have the ecosystem role, and then there's industry priorities for maximizing their ability to reach their catch targets. So maybe if you have any additional information on that. And number two, for the preferred times and FMP specific management processes, like you pointed out earlier, we have in our stock assessment terms of reference, kind of just an invitation to use ecosystem information, plus some of our individual species. There are places for ecosystem information that are not that clearly defined. So are you looking kind of just for the times and kind of looking at Appendix A and making sure you guys got the times right? Or is it more like where specifically and what specific information would be most useful, if that's clear?
Yes, thank you. Those are some good questions. So let me see if I might answer the last one first and then ask you to, all right. So on the appendix,
yes, please first check the timing of everything, because, you know, a lot of this is just a dance to make sure that the stuff comes in at the right time. One of the reasons we've seen some really good uptake of ecosystem and climate information in the salmon management process is because the ecosystem status report happens to come in to the council during the March meeting, which is a super intense salmon meeting. So that information is available right there and then. So if you think about that, like, what are the optimal meetings for bringing new information in support of CPS management? So we want to try to capture that in the, you know, in the information that we're asking about in the appendix. So, but it is, you know, just a process description. And if it's wrong, we want to know. And if there are subtleties, we'd like to know that too. If the CPSMT has, or the CPSAS have some insights into where ecosystem information is used in different parts of the process that we may not have thought of or written about, that is also great information to have. And then I think you also asked about our question, which is a point on the bottom of page 1. We're asking for preferred methods or priorities for grouping council managed species together when choosing new species groups for future ecosystem and climate information reports. So as I mentioned, and it, you know, it differs by FMP. The FMP is where there's only a few species. Well, I guess salmon only has a couple of species, but it's got a whole bunch of different salmon stocks. So, and that's not really a good analogy. But if there are particular groupings that you think make sense, either because they're all targeted by one group of boats, or because or you think there's some biological reason to group them together, like they all respond similarly to the same ecosystem signals, and it may not be good to group your species together. So any thoughts on that nature would be helpful as well.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Okay, Deb Wilson-Vandenberg is next, followed by Michelle Conrad.
Thanks for your presentation, Yvonne, and keeping it short and sweet, and for highlighting to us that getting these initiatives off the ground and going, sometimes it takes a lot of pushing and pulling and moving and hard thinking and different things. So I feel like we're right in the middle of that. So this is going to be more, I think, of an observation that I need help with, and it feels to me, process-wise, that where we're at by choosing Petrale sole, which I recognize the reasons for that and don't have issue with that. But what I'm trying to figure out in my own mind is, while picking Petrale sole perhaps at the same time as trying to put together these other parts of the process, you know, making sure we're developing the right criteria and that we're coming up with perhaps a risk takeable that works for a management regime or whatever. I guess the challenge for me in my mind is, are there any issues with doing those at the same time that we should be maybe particularly thinking about, or I'm maybe overthinking this and I should go back to the drawing board and read your report again? Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. I appreciate your checking on us as a former state staffer and workload appreciator. We proposed the process that we thought we could handle. So unless there's been some radical worrying from our folks who might want to comment on it, the process that we proposed in the EWG report was what we thought we could get done by September. Okay, does anyone else from the EWG want to comment on that? And if not, we'll go to Michelle Conrad. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thanks, Yvonne, for the presentation. I had a few questions. The first one relative to petrale as a demonstration species, and just whether the EWG had a discussion about the trade-offs associated with having a range of stocks in the demonstration species. So a range across perhaps more than one FMP, and stocks that may be more or less vulnerable to climate, so that maybe we could get a little bit more information out of the pilot.
So we did have that conversation, but we are recommending the process that we're recommending because we wanted, the goal of the initiative is not to provide ecosystem reports on a range of species. The goal of the initiative is to develop a long-term process that will ensure that the council is able to get ecosystem reports on a range of species at the appropriate times in the management processes for the different FMPs. And so we wanted to be able to quickly show the council what it is we were talking about in terms of a risk assessment report, and help the council develop a process that would allow them to choose future species. We had talked about providing the council with a choice of species at this meeting, and then try to start going through each of those criteria under the different ecosystem, economic, and management categories for the council and whatnot. But it rapidly became apparent that that was too much, and we were going too far down the road without checking in with the council or providing the council with a more clear illustration of what kind of work was being used and shared in other fishery management councils.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I guess, and I don't disagree with your characterization of the objective of the initiative. I guess our thought was more of the tools that the council may want to use. So, a risk table or some other tool potentially might look different for the different FMPs, just given the biological differences in the stocks, if you will. So just thinking that if what comes out of the initiative is the council having a process to, add more species in the future, it might be helpful for them to have more, demonstration products up front of what that might look like for the different FMPs or for different types of stocks. And I guess along those lines, did the EWG have a discussion about other tools other than the risk table? And after examining a few others decided the risk table was the best one to use, or just kind of what was behind that thinking?
So thank you for the question. The answers to those questions, at least to some extent, are in our report. I will say that we heard, I don't remember, I think it was last September, or it might have been the prior March, from the HMSMT asking us to hold off on doing any HMS species because of some of the work that they've got going on in the international arena. So we had sort of toyed with some HMS species, but left that off of our list for potential pilot species. There's also a, as we note in our report, there's been a sort of organic process with the annual salmon management and with a bringing of ecosystem information into the salmon management process. And so the ecosystem work group didn't want to step in the way of that process, but we are interested in checking in with the salmon advisory bodies to sort of figure out how that process is going and how it's working, whether it needs to be, there's any sort of ways of making it more convenient or useful for the participants, and also are there translations from that salmon process to other processes. So there's a lot of that information in our report already, and we chose risk tables to start with because that is the particular space in the council decision-making process where this kind of information can be used. I will say that the council is, as everyone knows, engaged in other decision-making processes beyond their harvest setting decisions, but this initiative focuses on harvest setting and management measures. I see Deb Wilson-Vandenberg has a blue hand up. And then Lorna Wargo.
Well, I did have a hand up until you got to your very last sentence, Yvonne. So I was thinking back, while Michelle was asking her question, I was thinking back on the statement that Anna made and thinking about the use of ecosystem information in terms of the initiative, but in a broader context than perhaps setting harvest guidelines and that kind of thing. And because that was part of the piece I saw, maybe misinterpreted in Anna's question, which was, you may look at other things that are specific to the process of what we do in management, but perhaps not specific to setting a harvest guideline or setting with something else, or fitting it maybe more into the assessment end of things. And so I was kind of thinking from that perspective of the risk assessment table related to setting harvest limits as perhaps one tool, but that you might set up similar tables for other parts of the process or other pieces of it, or and I'm having a really hard time coming up with any good examples of what I'm thinking of, so I apologize for that. But I guess based on your very last statement, now I'm wondering if those other tools that I'm thinking of might go in a different toolbox than the ones we want for this initiative. Do you want to respond to that?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure what other tools you're thinking of. But if you have a great idea, then please put it in the EAS report.
Thanks. I'll
Or
give
you
it
can-
more thought over the next few days.
Okay. Thanks. Go ahead, Lorna, and then Michelle is up next after Lorna.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. So circling back to your saying that you're looking for like when the optimal time is to bring information in. And then you mentioned how for salmon, they get the stoplight tables at March. And in trying to think, and I'm a bit challenged here because I've got years of CPS experience, but have yet to go through a complete groundfish harvest spec cycle. So trying to see optimal from my vantage point is a bit cloudy. But I'm thinking again, kind of depending on who pulls the information together, I guess that's not clear to me. So somebody's built the stoplight table for salmon managers to use. Where is that information in the future? So we have a species group for groundfish. Where will that information come from? Or like who's putting that, synthesizing that information? Because to me, that would be key to know an optimal time for like, I don't know, I guess I'm struggling a bit, like when does this process start and how much of it is like GMT driven or GMT receiving information that we then somehow incorporate into our harvest specs package process recommendations to the council. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just.
Yeah, thank you, Lorna. So my hat is off to you for going from years of CPS to now groundfish. That is, switching from one area of significant expertise to another is challenging. So I think our goal is to get from the management teams what is the right time. And, I can imagine it coming in a couple different fashions. And again, EWG members, if you have ideas, please do speak up and amend. But, it could be a brief PDF style report where you would hear from somebody like Chris or Andy, but with more focus on the given species group, and for a few minutes at some future GMT meeting. Kiva mentioned in the chat that they're presented with the stock assessments, so that's a possibility. Another possibility that we talked about in some of the early framing writing about the initiative was to wonder, could this be information that similar to the GMT focused tables and reports in the PacFin database, could we set up some kind of automated reporting process where management team members could go into an IEA database and get reports on the indicators that are useful to the species that they're thinking about. And so the vetting process would be which indicators go with which species and what do you want this report to look like? And then going forward, you would be able to generate those reports online as needed. So that's another possibility. And then that way it wouldn't be so dependent on a formal report transmittal process. Does that sort of help?
Yeah, I think it does. I think what I'm hearing from you is that there'd be a synthesis of information and it might come at, like maybe Kiva said, the stock assessment point time or at some future meeting and perhaps more, I don't know, quote unquote, automated in the future. But I think we'll just have to have some discussion about like what is optimal time depending on the process. And obviously GMT will have discussion about this. Because I guess it just depends on optimal, depends on what the package of information, like how refined or how much work it needs before it's useful. So, and if that's doable, like if we got information in June at the start of a harvest spec cycle, is that layering on workload that's maybe too much, or would the process need to actually back up before the start of a specs cycle? So anyways,
Those are all good questions.
Okay. Well, and I think that's why you're asking us to help provide some of that information. So I appreciate that.
Exactly.
Feedback. Yep. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Michelle, and then Anna, you're next.
Thanks, Yvonne. That was a very helpful comment and exchange. And I just wanted to follow up on what Deb Wilson-Vandenberg had also raised. And I think this kind of gets to the same point. When the EAS had talked about this in September, I guess we had viewed the initiative to be relative to indicators or information that could be provided, not necessarily just in the context of harvest setting. And so if there could be the development of an automated reporting process, for example, the council, in our view, could look at stocks that they were interested in as having an indicator that could just signal a potential point of concern that just triggers a review, a more in-depth review by the management team or something like that. And so if there were an automated reporting process, then the timing of that would just be something that could just be available online, that the management team, it would be incumbent upon the management team to monitor and go and check in, relative to when in-season considerations might be before the council, as an example, rather than having the timing of that be, coincident with the harvest setting process. So I appreciate that if that's also kind of a possibility out of this initiative.
So thank you. So I'm not sure if I don't want to promise something that we can't deliver, but I think if we do end up with automated reporting, and if that can be useful to in-season management, that's another possibility, certainly. You can also imagine that in the council process for choosing or recommending, rather, which species are up next for stock assessments, the council might look at the indicators, the ecosystem indicators for the different species that are possible, and decide that, well, it looks like this species is maybe a higher priority for assessment than we thought, because there are things happening in the ecosystem that may indicate some change in stock status that we hadn't otherwise anticipated. So things like that, you can sort of imagine where having a regular report available at fingertips might be useful. Of course, as with everything and similar to PACFIN, the key is understanding the cycle for data updates, so that, the IEA team knows or is able to be clear on when they're revising the contents of those reports and indicators. So I'll just leave it at that. And hopefully I saw Chris Harvey on the line. Hopefully I'm not shocking him with, with mentioning automated reports. So Anna, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I want to support what Michelle just said, especially around I'm not sure whether automated reporting is possible, right away, but kind of thinking about from a conservation perspective, the potential point of concern that could be more readily identified by these indicators and this framework than exists now. It could be extremely helpful. I want to point out, kind of back to what Yvonne was saying. What Deb was saying. I wanted to note a through line between the CPS-AS report from September on this process, this initiative, focusing on 2.1 and what you guys put in your report. So on page 4, and this is toward kind of a thought on what I would like to talk about in my advisory body tomorrow, and what we may advocate for in our report. So on page 4, you put the EWG is also interested in whether ecosystem or climate information could be useful in supporting groundfish catch and bycatch management, groundfish stock assessment process, or coastal pelagic species season development. So in our September 22 report, we said we recommend highlighting existing built-in opportunities for integrating climate information to management. We put an example, which is the central subpopulation of northern anchovy in COP9 allows the council to consider any relevant factors when setting annual catch limits, including ecosystem indicators and trends and surveys indices. And we offer that as a way to operationalize the FMP specific indicator reports. So I guess what we may suggest in our report, if my advisory body thinks this is a good idea, is for your September 2023 revised draft, maybe a way to capture some of these kind of practical operationalizing ideas from advisory bodies in some way that they can be then more easily developed, in the coming months and years.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that's a great idea. And let's see. So I'm just making a note. Let's think of Appendix A as something that can definitely be expanded with other ideas. And okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Let's see, Don Vernon.
Yeah, I'm with the SAS. It's been very useful to have the stoplight chart for ocean conditions. We're starting to see a little bit on the in-stream fishery issues of temperature. And I was wondering, and this is kind of blue sky, could we develop a similar table for maybe some of the several major river basins to see what temperature might do for the salmon, during their life cycle phases in freshwater? And the indicator to me, at least in the Northwest, might be snowpack. We could look at snowpack totals in January or February, and those could be a good indication of what the water year may look like. And that way we could say, we're going to have a good ocean conditions, good snowpack conditions, so we could maybe allow a little more catch rather than being so conservative to say we got to reduce catch because of these uncertainties. It is my crazy blue sky thought of the day.
Thanks, Don. I think that is exactly the sort of blue sky that we're looking for. And I will say, I should open it up. And if anyone from the IEA wants to speak about this, just scrambling to find the link to the ecosystem status report. I thought there were some, in past years, there have been some discussions of snowpack, and I see Corey Green has his hand raised, so maybe he's raising his hand to help me out. Is that what you're doing, Corey?
Yeah, we have summarized snowpack for the West Coast, so that could conceivably be brought in. We also summarize temperature as well for those gauges that do temperature, and there's other ways to infer that as well. So your idea is entirely conceivable and within sort of the scope of what we're doing already.
Okay, it's good to know. I'm somewhat new to the process, so I appreciate another history lesson in my learning curve.
No, it's great. I will just say, Don, that as you might imagine, a few years ago, snowpack just became such a big interest for the council when we had some really bad years, and so it became a regular part of the report. And Appendix G of the report, which I think Andrew just put in the chat, the link to that. Oh no, Jamil put that in the chat. So Appendix G is the snowpack, stream flow, and stream temperature report. Thank you. Corey, did you have a further comment or question? Okay. All right. Does anyone else have any comments, questions, ideas on the ecosystem initiative? Oh, good. Chris Harvey says online we have stream flow indicators broken out more finely by Chinook salmon. My mind is blanking on the ESU acronym. Evolutionarily significant unit. Okay, if there's no more questions on the initiative, we might take a 5-minute break, and then work group,